In this brief section, we'll look at Woodrow Wilson and try to understand how he ended America's imperialist age. When Wilson took over in 1913 as America's first Democratic president in 16 years, he quickly criticized his Republican predecessor's imperialist and expansionist policies. The United States, Wilson pledged, would never, quote, again seek an additional foot of territory by conquest, unquote. Wilson, you recall, was a moralist. He wasn't an imperialist. He saw colonies and control as something that had been done to America in its past, and America wouldn't do that. The age of imperialism, therefore, as I say, had ended with Wilson's presidency. Now, be clear, at the same time, however, Wilson's ascendancy to the presidency did not mean a return to isolationism. Wilson wanted to be involved in world affairs, and he would intervene when he thought it was necessary. The difference was his motives. His motives were to advance, in his own words, quote, human rights, national integrity, and opportunity, unquote. He wanted these things abroad, and he was willing to go abroad to spread them. It was not to augment American control. It was not to do what was best for America per se. It's not imperialism. But it was rather to augment the common good as he saw it. Of course, Wilson's view of the common good was often ethnocentric. It often translated into the spread of American influence because American influence, Wilson believed, was a good thing. Wilson was an ardent Christian, and he believed Americans could help enlighten the poor peoples of the world. Moreover, while Wilson did not seek, overt empire like Roosevelt, he was under political pressure not to lose the control Americans had already established during his predecessors. What all this meant was that Wilson was as much an interventionist as his predecessors. For many of the peoples in the undeveloped countries, the American motives kind of felt irrelevant. America still seemed to be calling the shots. A case in point was Wilson's actions in the Caribbean soon after he took office in 1913. Taft had sent Marines into Nicaragua to support the pro-American president, Adolfo Diaz, and Wilson left them there. When violence broke out in Haiti and the Dominican Republic, Wilson brutally suppressed resistance to the American-backed governments. Marines stayed in both countries for a number of years. They were there, Wilson rationalized, to prevent anarchy and starvation, as well as to protect their shipping routes to the Panama Canal. When the Dominicans refused to ratify a pro-American treaty, the American naval commander even established a military government in November 1916. Wilson was especially worried about order and good government in America's southern neighbor, Mexico. Mexico had been divided between a really wealthy landowning elite and a really poor, impoverished peasantry for a long time. In 1911, right about a year before Wilson took office, the 30-year government of Porfirio Diaz was ended by a democratic reformer, Francisco Madero. Diaz had defended the wealthy elite, and Americans welcomed the reforms that Madero offered. Early in 1913, just as Wilson took office, Mexico had another development as Mexican troops loyal to General Victoriano Huerta, a full-blood Indian, overthrew and murdered Madero. Mexico then appeared near chaos. 40,000 Americans had settled in Mexico, and American investors had poured almost $2 billion into Mexican oil wells and other ventures. Wilson was, of course, worried. Reversing his policy of the U.S. recognizing all governments, Wilson refused to recognize Huerta's regime, which he called, quote, a government of butchers. Wilson moved quickly, blockading the port of Veracruz to prevent a shipment of arms from reaching Huerta, announcing that he was, quote, going to teach the South American Republic to elect good men, unquote. Wilson sent 7,000 troops into Mexico in April 1914 to support General Venustiano Carranza, who Wilson saw as Mexico's best option for democracy and prosperity. The American troops lost 65 lives fighting Huerta's forces, who lost approximately 500 men. In the end, Huerta abdicated and Carranza took power. The U.S. troops eventually withdrew. As Wilson's presidency continued, however, the turmoil really didn't die down. In January 1916, a bandit chieftain in northern Mexico, Pancho Villa, murdered 16 U.S. mining engineers. Soon after, Villa's gang burned the town of Columbus, New Mexico, and killed 19 inhabitants. Enraged Americans demanded action. Wilson quickly sent a punitive expedition under General John J. Pershing. When Pancho Villa was not only eluded Pershing, but, brazenly staged another cross-border raid into Texas, Wilson was angered, and he ordered 150,000 National Guardsmen to the Mexican border, a massive response that stirred anti-American feelings among the Mexicans poor, for whom Villa was kind of a folk hero. Villa finally ended his raids in 1922 in exchange for a large grant of land from the Mexican government, but he was assassinated in 1923. By this point, Wilson's foreign policy was dominated by the war in Europe, kind of like his domestic policy was by this point. The war in 1916 had been going on for 2 years. Wilson would approach this war with this same idealistic, moralist foreign policy. This, however, is covered in the lecture on World War I. This includes the lecture on Wilson and the End of American Imperialism.